This is for research methods. The first thing we're going to talk about is just how to know what statistical test to use in Jamovi. And this is just us discussing a few of the tests for this class. So this is not an exhaustive list of all the tests that you could be doing, but for our second group project, this is just that information. So we have a few different types of data that we could be working with. So okay. So if we're comparing means on something with just one independent variable, so one independent variable, one dependent variable, if we have two groups, we would be using an independent samples t-test, and this is for between subjects research. So if we have two groups or two conditions, so for example, if you were looking at just the binary gender male-female, or if you were looking at people with siblings, people versus people without siblings, first generation students versus not first generation students, anything to that effect, like whether someone's a student athlete or not an athlete, that kind of thing, that would be two different groups or conditions. And this is for a quasi-experimental design, so with no true manipulation really here. We're just looking at two different groups that naturally separate themselves into those groups. So this would be for between subjects only. So that basically means that the groups are mutually exclusive, so you can't be in more than one group at the same time, which is why it's between instead of within. So the paired samples t-test is what we would use if we were doing this with a within subjects design. So if we were looking at how someone scored on a pre-test versus a post-test, where we're comparing the person's scores to the same person's scores later on. So we're comparing how they performed earlier to how they performed later, and comparing them to themselves versus comparing them to another group of people. This is a within subjects design because everyone experienced every level of the independent variable. So for this, we would use the paired samples t-test, like I said. So basically, just when you're determining which type of test to use when you have two groups or two conditions that you're doing, like if you had an experimental and a control, that would be two conditions also. Just know that if everyone experienced every level, then that's within subjects and you would do a paired samples t-test. And if everyone only experienced one level, so like if they were only sorted into siblings or no siblings, they couldn't possibly be in both groups, so we know that's between subjects. If they got the experimental condition, they didn't get the control condition, so that's also between subjects. Hopefully that makes sense somewhat. And then if we are comparing means with one independent variable, but we have more than two groups or conditions, we would use something called an analysis of variance or ANOVA. For this, like if we have three or more groups, basically, say we were doing two different experimental conditions, and then we had a control condition as well. So we were comparing like taking a GRE preparation course versus like studying for the GRE a set amount of hours being our second experimental condition, and then the third condition being just a control condition, that kind of thing. We would have three groups there. Or if we were looking at, if we were comparing like freshmen versus sophomores, juniors, seniors, we would have four groups there, so we would use an ANOVA there to compare like each group. And we could do this with a variety of different things, so it could be whether we have different experimental and control conditions, like at least three of them, or naturally segregated groups, much like the two conditions, just groups that would sort into three or more conditions. So that's when we would use an ANOVA. So the next one, so if we have at least two independent variables, so this is also called a factorial design. I know we've talked about that a lot in class. When this is the case, we also use an analysis of variance or ANOVA, and I will explain that in a future video when I'm talking about how to actually do the ANOVA, but this is when we have at least two independent variables. So if we were looking at both like scores on a measure, so like people who scored high in self-esteem versus low in self-esteem, and we also wanted to look at the impact of gender on this, so we were looking at both of those independent variables, we would use an ANOVA. So anytime when we have two independent variables, we'll use an ANOVA. If we have more than two, we would also use an ANOVA. And then lastly, if we're comparing counts or frequencies, so if we're working with nominal data, we use the chi-square test. So this would just be if you were comparing, say you were comparing different genders on whether they answered yes or no to a specific question. If your dependent variable is like a yes or no question, so you just count like how many people said yes in each group and comparing whether those groups are different. You could also do this. I think the example that we had in class was how many people were willing to sign a petition based on what group they were in, which condition they experienced. We use a chi-square for something like this because we're just counting like how many signatures we got on the petition. So it's just counting. It's just based on that nominal data there. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. And we will continue where I explain how to actually do these in the next test, or next video, sorry. Okay, take care.